Clara's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she pushed forward through the dense undergrowth, the damp earth beneath her feet muffling the desperate rhythm of her footsteps. The forest around her was a tangled maze of towering pines and gnarled oaks, their bare branches stretching out like skeletal fingers against the cold, gray sky. A biting wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the faint, distant echoes of a world she had left behind, one filled with fear and shadows she could no longer endure. She clutched her swollen belly protectively, every step a reminder of the fragile life growing inside her. The pregnancy, once a symbol of hope, had become a burden in these harsh woods, where each sound sparked a flicker of panic and every shadow seemed to loom with menace. Clara's eyes stung from exhaustion and tears she refused to shed, but she kept moving, driven by a singular, desperate need to find safety, to find refuge, anywhere but the suffocating prison of her past. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. Hours earlier, she had fled a world that no longer felt like home. The man she had once trusted had turned cruel, his words and fists leaving invisible scars deeper than any wound. Her friends had turned their backs, her family unreachable. Alone, terrified, and pregnant, Clara had chosen the wilderness over the suffocating walls of a life that threatened to consume her. The forest, with all its uncertainty, promised a chance, a sliver of hope in the chaos. As twilight began to darken the sky, Clara's weary eyes caught sight of something unexpected. A faint outline, hidden among the thick brush and twisted roots. A cabin, old and weathered, its wooden walls sagged beneath years of neglect. Yet it stood defiantly against the encroaching wilderness, as if guarding a secret too burdensome to abandon. The roof was cloaked in moss, and a thin wisp of smoke curled upward from a crooked chimney, suggesting life or at least recent habitation. The sight was a balm to Clara's frayed nerves. Her legs trembled as she quickened her pace, the promise of shelter stirring a fragile spark of hope deep within her. She pushed aside hanging vines and ducked beneath low branches until she reached the porch, where the wood groaned softly under her tentative weight. The cabin's door hung slightly ajar, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp earth and forgotten memories. With a trembling hand, Clara pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint creak of settling timbers and the distant call of an owl. Dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through grimy windows, casting ghostly patterns on the rough-hewn floorboards. The cabin was sparse. An old table, a rickety chair, and a fireplace cold and empty. But it was shelter. It was safety, fragile and uncertain, yet real. Clara sank to the floor, her body aching and her mind swirling with exhaustion and relief. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the steady flutter of life within, a heartbeat that tethered her to hope. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to let the tremors of fear ease just enough to feel the warmth of possibility. Yet beneath that fragile comfort was a gnawing unease. The cabin felt too still, too untouched. It was as if time itself had paused within these walls, leaving behind whispers of the past that clung like cobwebs. Clara's fingers trailed along the rough wood of the table, tracing invisible lines that seemed to lead deeper into the shadows. She shivered, not from cold, but from a sense that she was not alone. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, revealing details that deepened the mystery. A cracked mirror hung crookedly on one wall, its surface mottled with age. A moth-eaten quilt lay folded in the corner, dusty but carefully arranged. The fireplace held remnants of ashes long cold, yet the faint scent of burnt wood lingered, as if a fire had died only recently. A small stack of yellowed newspapers lay piled on a shelf, their headlines faded and forgotten. Clara's fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound book resting atop the papers. She opened it cautiously, the brittle pages whispering secrets as they turned. The handwriting was neat but hurried, filled with lists, dates, and cryptic notes that spoke of anticipation and fear. Her pulse quickened as she realized she'd stumbled upon a journal, a window into the life of someone who had once called this place home. The dusk outside deepened, shadows lengthening and pressing against the cabin's fragile walls. Clara sat back, clutching the journal to her chest, the weight of loneliness and hope mingling within her. She was a stranger in this forgotten place, a woman adrift between past and future, carrying a secret life she was determined to protect. Her thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought her here. The nights spent hiding in alleys, the whispered threats behind closed doors, and the crushing silence of a family that had turned away. The forest had been her last refuge, and now this cabin, with all its mysteries and memories, had become her sanctuary. But as the cold seeped through the cracks and the wind moaned softly outside, Clara knew she could not remain passive. She had to understand this place, to unravel the threads of its story, if she was to find the strength to survive. The cabin held secrets, secrets that whispered of pain and loss, but also of resilience and perhaps, like her, a hope for a new beginning. With a deep breath, Clara rose unsteadily to her feet. She moved toward the window, peering into the gathering darkness where the forest loomed like a silent guardian. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. But for now, she had found a place to rest, to heal, to gather strength. Her fingers tightened around the journal as she settled near the fireplace, the flicker of fading daylight casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Clara traced the names and dates in the worn pages, feeling an inexplicable connection to the woman who had written them. A woman who, like her, had sought refuge within these walls. As night fully claimed the forest, Clara wrapped herself in the threadbare quilt, pressing close to the fragile warmth it offered. Her thoughts drifted between fear and hope, past and future, as she surrendered to the quiet embrace of the cabin. In this place, she was no longer just a fugitive fleeing her past. She was a mother-to-be on the cusp of a journey that would test every ounce of her courage. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the secrets of the forest and the promise of a dawn yet to come. Clara closed her eyes, the journal resting on her lap, and in the stillness, she vowed to face whatever shadows lay ahead, not just for herself, but for the life she was determined to protect at all costs. The first full night in the cabin settled with a heavy stillness that pressed against Clara's skin like a weight. Outside, the forest whispered its ancient lullabies, a soft susurration of wind through the skeletal branches and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving in the dark. Inside, the cabin held its breath, silent as a forgotten tomb. Clara lay curled beneath the threadbare quilt, the worn pages of the journal resting beside her, a fragile tether to the life that had once filled this lonely place. Morning light spilled hesitantly through the grimy windows, casting pale, uneven beams across the rough wooden floor. Clara awoke to a strange sensation. The cabin felt different in daylight, less like a refuge and more like a relic of something lost. The air was thick with dust and the scent of damp wood. But beneath that, an indefinable presence lingered, as though the walls themselves held onto stories too heavy to release. Rising slowly, Clara moved to the window and peered out at the forest beyond. The trees swayed gently, their branches interweaving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like silent watchers keeping vigil. The isolation was profound. The cabin nestled so deeply in the wilderness that the outside world felt a distant memory, a faint echo she could barely grasp. She stepped further into the room, her fingers trailing along surfaces coated with years of neglect. The table was scattered with a thin layer of dust, broken only by the faint imprint of a hand that had once rested there. A cracked ceramic mug sat abandoned near the edge, stained and chipped, telling a story of use and then sudden desertion. Yet, despite the decay, a strange order seemed to persist. Everything had its place, as if someone had left in a hurry, but with intention. Clara's gaze settled on the hearth, where charred logs lay cold and brittle. She knelt to examine the ashes, her fingertips brushing the fine black powder. The fire had not been lit for a long time, yet the faint scent of smoke clung stubbornly to the air, a ghost of warmth that refused to fade completely. It was an eerie juxtaposition, the presence of life in a place seemingly abandoned. Her exploration took her to the far wall, where a faded tapestry hung askew, its colors dulled by time. Beneath it, a small wooden chest sat locked, its surface scarred and worn. Clara's heart quickened at the sight. Locked chests in forgotten cabins were often vessels of secrets, repositories of memories best left undisturbed, or sometimes keys to understanding. She jiggled the rusty latch, but it held firm. For now, it was another mystery to add to the growing list. A creaking noise startled her, sharp and unexpected in the stillness. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, a soft groan from the floorboards beneath her feet, or perhaps the walls settling with the shifting cold. Her pulse throbbed in her ears as she scanned the dim corners of the cabin, the shadows twisting and lengthening as the sun climbed higher. There was no sign of movement, yet the feeling of being watched prickled her skin. The cabin was not just empty wood and stone. It held an atmosphere, a residue of lives lived and lost, layered with memories that clung like a second skin. Clara's unease grew as she realized that this was no ordinary shelter. It was a place suspended in time, caught between the living and the forgotten. She moved to the small kitchenette, where a rusty kettle and cracked plates sat coated with dust. The cupboards creaked open, revealing faded jars filled with remnants of dried herbs and forgotten spices. These small details hinted at a life once sustained within these walls, a life that had abruptly ceased, leaving behind only echoes. Clara's eyes caught sight of a mirror hanging crookedly on the wall near the door. Its surface was mottled and cracked, reflecting a fragmented image of the room and herself. She stared into it, searching for something, a sign, a clue, or perhaps just reassurance that she was real and alive in this place that seemed to blur the lines between reality and memory. As the day wore on, Clara's unease deepened. Every creak, every whisper of wind seemed amplified in the quiet of the cabin. At times, she thought she could hear faint footsteps echoing just beyond the walls, or catch a glimpse of flickering shadows darting in the corners of her vision. Each time she turned, there was nothing but silence and empty space. The isolation weighed heavily on her. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability here. Pregnant, alone, surrounded by an unfamiliar wilderness, and a cabin that felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. Yet, despite the growing tension, Clara found herself drawn to the peculiar stillness, as if the cabin's silence held answers she needed to find. She returned to the journal, flipping through its brittle pages under the weak light of the afternoon sun. The handwriting was neat but hurried, filled with fragmented thoughts and cryptic references. The entries spoke of anticipation and sorrow, of waiting and loss. Clara's fingers trembled as she read, feeling the weight of the woman's story pressing down on her own. A sudden chill swept through the room, causing the candle on the windowsill to flicker and gutter. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold air. The temperature had dropped inexplicably, and the cabin seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer as if to whisper secrets meant only for her ears. She moved toward the door, her hand resting on the worn handle, considering whether to step back into the forest. Outside was uncertainty, but here was a strange kind of confinement. The cabin's quiet was not peace, but a heavy, watchful presence that refused to be ignored. As dusk approached, Clara prepared a small meal from the sparse provisions she had found in the cupboard. The act of cooking was grounding, a thread of normalcy woven through the growing strangeness of her surroundings. The aroma of boiling water and dried herbs filled the air, momentarily pushing back the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners. Sitting by the window, Clara's gaze drifted beyond the glass to the tangled forest edges. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches scratching against the sky, dark and foreboding. The wind picked up, carrying faint voices, or perhaps just the rustle of leaves, indistinct but persistent. Her thoughts returned to the cabin's previous occupant, the woman whose journal she held, whose story was etched into every corner of this place. There was a thread connecting them, invisible yet undeniable, woven through shared solitude and the fragile hope of new life. Night fell slowly, swallowing the light and deepening the shadows that hugged the cabin's walls. Clara extinguished the candle, leaving only the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. The silence was thick, almost palpable, a living thing that moved with the breath of the house. As she lay down once more beneath the quilt, Clara felt the weight of the cabin's past settle around her, a presence both haunting and protective. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of whispered voices and fleeting shadows, of footsteps that approached and then receded into the darkness. In the morning, she would need to explore further, to uncover the secrets that the cabin held tight. But for now, she allowed herself to surrender to the uneasy peace, caught between fear and curiosity, between the living and the echoes of what once was. Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted the faded journal from the rough wooden table, the brittle pages whispering faintly beneath her touch. The cabin, with its peeling wallpaper and time-worn furniture, seemed to breathe around her, holding its secrets close. But the journal was a key, fragile, worn, yet potent. And Clara's curiosity pulled her deeper into the mystery woven into these walls. She settled into the crooked chair by the window, the weak sunlight filtering through cracked panes casting pale patterns onto the floorboards. The air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of old paper. Clara's eyes scanned the pages, the neat yet hurried handwriting revealing glimpses of a life once lived here, a life marked by hope and dread in equal measure. The entries began with anticipation, delicate notes about preparing for a new arrival. The flutter of excitement mingled with cautious optimism. A woman named Lila had written them, her name appearing in looping script at the top of a page. She spoke of days spent arranging the cabin, sewing tiny garments, and whispering lullabies into the silence. Clara felt a pang of kinship, the shared experience of impending motherhood bridging the gulf of years and circumstance. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. The neat lines grew shaky, the words more fragmented. Lila's entries hinted at something darker lurking beneath the surface, a fear that shadowed her days and haunted her nights. References to unseen eyes, whispers in the walls, and footsteps when no one walked unsettled Clara deeply. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a vessel of unease, a place where the past clung like a shroud. Clara's heart raced as she uncovered a folded piece of paper tucked between two pages. The paper was yellowed and brittle, covered in a scrawl of hurried writing that was difficult to decipher. It spoke cryptically of a presence that would not be silenced, a secret that must be kept, and a desperate plea for forgiveness. The words were tangled with emotion, fear, regret, and sorrow radiating from the inked lines. A sudden creak from the floor startled Clara, snapping her gaze up as the cabin's silence pressed in again. The walls seemed to lean closer, the shadows deepening, as if the house itself were watching. She swallowed hard, the chill crawling along her spine. Yet the journal's revelations ignited a fierce determination within her, a need to understand the story embedded in the cabin's bones. As she delved further, Clara found photographs tucked between pages, faded snapshots of a young woman with haunted eyes cradling a small child, the edges curled and torn. The images were blurred, but the tenderness captured within them was unmistakable. They spoke of love and loss, of moments suspended in time. Clara traced the outline of the woman's face with a trembling finger, feeling the weight of her story intertwine with her own. The journal also contained maps and sketches, rough drawings of the forest surrounding the cabin, marked with cryptic symbols and notes about places to avoid. One page detailed a hidden path leading to a small clearing, described as a place of refuge and reckoning. Clara's pulse quickened. This was more than a diary. It was a map of memories and warnings, a testament to a life shadowed by secrets. Night was falling now, the room dimming as the sun dipped behind the trees. Clara's fingers lingered on the journal, reluctant to close the door on Lila's world so soon. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the silence thick and expectant. She felt the weight of the past pressing down, yet also the fragile hope that understanding might bring. Her thoughts drifted to the strange sensations she'd felt since arriving, the unexplained cold spots, the fleeting shadows, the sense of unseen watchers. Now, with the journal's words echoing in her mind, those sensations took on new meaning. This place was alive with memories, bound to the pain and longing of the woman who had once sought sanctuary here. Clara's resolve hardened. She would uncover the truth behind the cabin's haunting, for herself and for the life she carried within her. The journal was a lifeline, a bridge spanning the gulf between past and present. Through its pages, Lila's voice spoke across time, urging Clara to listen, to remember, and to confront the shadows that lingered. She carefully closed the journal and set it aside, the echoes of its story settling into the quiet room. The cabin was no longer just a refuge from the forest. It was a repository of secrets waiting to be unearthed. Clara rose, her steps steady despite the tremor of fear coursing through her. She moved toward the fireplace, tracing her fingers over the cold hearth, imagining the fires that once burned here, the warmth that had filled the air. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and Clara's eyes darted toward the door. The wind whispered through the cracks, carrying with it a faint murmur like a sigh, or perhaps a warning. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath her palm, a reminder of the life she was protecting amid the shadows. Determined, Clara gathered the photographs and notes, placing them carefully into a bundle. Tomorrow, she would explore the forest beyond the cabin, follow the path marked in the journal, and seek out the clearing that promised answers. Tonight, she would rest. But her mind was alight with questions and the profound weight of a story half told. As darkness deepened, Clara settled beneath the quilt, the journal's pages still vivid in her mind. The cabin seemed to hold its breath once more, the boundary between past and present blurring like mist. She closed her eyes, the whispered words of Lila weaving through her dreams, a haunting lullaby of hope, fear, and the unbreakable bond between two women, separated by time, but united by courage. The chill of dawn seeped through the cracked window panes, casting pale light over the cabin's worn wooden floor. Clara awoke with a start, the remnants of dreams tangled, with whispers of the past clinging to her mind like cobwebs. She pressed a trembling hand to her belly, feeling the steady, reassuring flutter within, a life burgeoning amidst the uncertainty that had swallowed her own. But the fragile comfort was quickly shadowed by the weight of memories she could no longer ignore. As she sat quietly, the fog of sleep lifting, Clara's thoughts drifted back to the fragments of her own past, the fractured pieces that had driven her deep into the forest's embrace. Memories surfaced unbidden, the sharp sting of raised voices behind closed doors, the cold indifference of those who should have cared, and the relentless fear that had gnawed at her from within. She remembered the nights spent hiding in cramped apartments, the bruises concealed beneath long sleeves, and the hollow ache of loneliness that no amount of whispered promises could soothe. The man she had once loved had transformed into a stranger whose shadow darkened every corner of her life. Leaving had been a desperate act of survival, propelled by the fragile hope that somewhere, somehow, she could find safety for herself and the child she carried. Yet, even now, far from the suffocating walls of her former life, Clara wrestled with fear and doubt. The forest was no sanctuary. It was a vast, indifferent wilderness that mirrored the isolation inside her. The cabin, with its peeling paint and lingering shadows, was a refuge, yes, but also a reminder that safety was never guaranteed. Her gaze fell upon the journal resting on the table, its fragile pages a testament to another woman's journey through similar darkness. Lila's words echoed in Clara's mind, weaving a tapestry of hope and despair that resonated with her own story. The parallels between their lives were haunting. Two women, separated by time yet united by struggle, seeking solace in the same forgotten sanctuary. Clara's breathing slowed as she allowed herself to reflect on the path that had led her here. The flashbacks came in fragments. The first time she had realized the man she loved had become dangerous, the moment she packed a small bag under the cover of night, and the agonizing decision to flee without telling anyone. Each memory was a wound and a lesson, etched deep into her soul. She recalled the quiet nights spent wrestling with guilt and fear, the fear that she wasn't strong enough, that her past would catch up to her, that her unborn child would pay the price for her choices. Those fears had driven her into the forest, away from the world she knew, and into the arms of uncertainty. But even in that darkness, Clara had clung to hope. The hope that she could break free from the cycle of violence and isolation, that she could build a life defined not by fear, but by love and resilience. The cabin, with its faded walls and whispered secrets, had become a symbol of that hope. A fragile beacon in a world that often seemed cruel and unforgiving. As the morning light grew stronger, Clara rose and moved to the small window. Staring out at the forest's edge, the trees stood tall and silent, their branches reaching skyward like outstretched hands. She imagined the journey ahead, the steps she would take to reclaim her life, to face the shadows of her past, and to embrace the uncertain future waiting beyond the trees. Her fingers tightened around the journal as she returned to the table. The pages held more than just a story. They held lessons, warnings, and a shared understanding born from hardship. Clara felt a quiet determination settle within her, a resolve to learn from the past, to honor the struggles of those who had come before, and to find strength in the knowledge that she was not alone. The memories were painful, yes, but they were also a source of power. They reminded her of the resilience that had carried her through dark nights and desperate days. They underscored the importance of fighting, not just for survival, but for a future where love could flourish despite the scars. Clara's thoughts turned to the life growing inside her, the delicate, beating heart that depended on her courage and will. She vowed silently to protect that life, to shield it from the shadows that had haunted her, and to create a world where fear did not dictate their existence. The cabin, with all its mysteries and memories, was the first step on that path. As she prepared a simple meal from the sparse provisions, Clara found a strange comfort in the routine. The act of tending to her body and her unborn child grounded her, tethering her to the present even as her mind wandered through the tangled web of past and future. The scent of boiling water and dried herbs filled the air, mingling with the faint mustiness of the cabin, a reminder that life persisted even in forgotten places. Later, as she wrapped herself in the faded quilt and settled near the cold hearth, Clara allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The cabin was more than shelter. It was a repository of stories, pain, and hope. It held the echoes of lives intertwined with her own, urging her to listen, to learn, and to find courage. Sleep came slowly that night, her dreams a patchwork of memories and whispered voices. She saw flashes of her own past, faces blurred by pain and regret, and glimpses of Lila's story unfolding in shadowed corners. Yet beneath the fear was a thread of light, a promise that even in darkness, new beginnings could take root. Clara awoke again before dawn, the forest outside shrouded in mist. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the steady pulse that anchored her to life and hope. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges both seen and unseen, but she was no longer merely fleeing. She was preparing to face the past, to claim her future, and to nurture the fragile life that gave her strength. With a steady breath, Clara rose and moved to the window once more. The forest awaited, vast and unknowable, but within her burned a quiet fire, a resolve forged from memory and hope, fear and courage. The cabin's walls held secrets yet to be uncovered, and she knew that understanding them was part of her own healing. The day had begun, and with it, the next chapter of Clara's journey. One shaped by the past, but not defined by it. Illuminated by the faint but unyielding light of hope. The forest outside the cabin seemed to breathe with a life of its own, the rustling leaves and shifting shadows weaving an uneasy symphony that tangled with Clara's thoughts. Each creak of the cabin's timbers, each whisper of wind through the broken panes, set her nerves alight, sharpening a growing sense of unease that gnawed at her restlessness. The stillness that had once felt like refuge now pressed in like a weight, heavy and oppressive, as if the very walls carried the memories of unseen eyes, watching from the dark. As Clara moved through the cabin, the faint noises, soft thuds, distant groans, the subtle scrape of something shifting, became impossible to dismiss. At first, she told herself it was the house settling, the natural sounds of a structure long neglected. But the pattern was too deliberate, the timing too uncanny. The noises seemed to echo just beyond the reach of her senses, teasing the edges of her awareness, like whispers she could almost hear but not quite grasp. Her heart pounded in her chest as she paused by the fireplace, the cold hearth a stark contrast to the rising tension that coiled within her. The shadows cast by the flickering light of a small lantern danced across the walls, twisting and writhing in shapes that threatened to take form. Clara swallowed hard, the familiar flutter of her unborn child, a fragile tether to reality amid the creeping fear. Outside, the wind intensified, rattling the window panes with an urgent insistence. A sudden draft swept through the cabin, carrying with it a faint scent, smoky and sweet, like burning wood mixed with something earthier, older. Clara's breath caught as she turned toward the source, eyes scanning the dim corners where darkness deepened unnaturally. The sensation of being watched tightened around her like a noose, and a shiver ran down her spine. She moved cautiously, each step deliberate but hesitant, as if the floorboards themselves might betray her presence. The creaking followed, a soft, rhythmic sound that matched the quickening beat of her heart. Clara reached the doorway leading to the small bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and paused. The air was colder here, the chill wrapping around her like a cloak, and the silence more profound. Inside, the faintest trace of movement caught her eye. A curtain fluttering despite the closed window, a shadow flickering at the edge of her vision. She blinked, rubbing her tired eyes, but the sensation remained, an unshakable certainty that she was not alone. The cabin's stillness was a mask, concealing something restless and watching. Clara's fingers trembled as she reached out to close the door, but hesitation held her back. The room seemed to pulse with energy, a lingering presence that whispered of loss and longing. She sensed a story etched into the very fabric of this place, a narrative of pain and fear that mirrored her own. Retreating to the main room, Clara tried to steady her breath, grounding herself in the tangible, the rough wooden table, the worn quilt, the journal that held the echoes of another life. Yet the unsettling noises persisted, a constant undercurrent threading through the silence. At times, she thought she could hear faint footsteps echoing beyond the walls, soft and deliberate, as if someone or something moved just out of sight. The isolation that had once offered solace now felt like a trap, the cabin transforming from sanctuary to prison. Clara's mind raced with questions and fears, each unanswered sound amplifying the shadows within her. The pregnancy, a source of strength, also heightened her vulnerability. Every unexplained noise sent ripples of anxiety through her, reminding her of the fragility of the life she carried. Seeking distraction, Clara returned to the journal, hoping the words of the past might anchor her in the present. But even the familiar script seemed tinged with unease, the stories of anticipation and dread echoing in the cabin's restless atmosphere. Lila's fears now felt less distant, more immediate, as if the past and present converged in the shifting shadows. As night deepened, the cabin's sounds grew more insistent. A soft tapping at the window, the creak of floorboards in empty rooms, the faint rustle of fabric. Clara's sleep was fractured by dreams of whispered voices and fleeting figures, shadows that reached out with cold fingers and vanished before she could grasp them. Each awakening left her breathless, heart pounding, the cabin's silence broken only by the distant call of an owl. One night, as Clara sat by the window, the moonlight casting silver ribbons across the floor, a sudden chill enveloped her. The air grew heavy, thick with a presence that pressed close. She felt a breath against her neck, a whisper of something unseen, and spun around, eyes wide and searching the dark. But there was nothing, only the silent cabin, its secrets folded into the night. Determined to confront the unease, Clara lit a small candle, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows that seemed to push back the darkness. She spoke aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath, telling the unseen watcher that she meant no harm, that she sought only peace and shelter for herself and her child. The words hung in the air, fragile bridges spanning the gulf between the living and the lingering past. The candle flickered, then steadied, and for a moment, the cabin held its breath. Clara felt a soft warmth spread through her chest, a gentle reassurance that she was not alone, but not threatened. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to acknowledge her courage and vulnerability, a silent pact forged in the quiet darkness. Though the noises persisted in the nights that followed, their menace seemed to wane, replaced by a quiet companionship, an uneasy truce between Clara and the shadows that inhabited the cabin. She began to understand that the house was more than a shelter. It was a living memory, a keeper of stories that reached across time to touch her own. Through the restless nights and whispered sounds, Clara found within herself a deepening resolve. The fear that had once threatened to overwhelm her now mingled with a fierce determination to protect the life she carried and to unravel the mysteries that surrounded her. The cabin, with all its creaks and shadows, was both a challenge and a sanctuary, a place where past and present collided. As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Clara sat by the window, the first light warming her face. The forest outside stirred with life, birdsong weaving through the trees. The cabin's eerie stillness had softened into a quiet watchfulness, and within Clara, a fragile peace took root, a promise that she would face whatever lay ahead with courage and hope. Clara sat at the edge of the worn wooden table, the fading light of late afternoon filtering through the grimy windows and casting long, uneven shadows across the cabin's interior. The journal lay open before her, its pages filled with the delicate script of a woman who had once sought refuge in this very place. The name Lila appeared again and again in the margins, a haunting echo from the past that now felt intimately entwined with Clara's own flight from a world that had become too dangerous to bear. As the days passed, Clara pieced together fragments of Lila's story, a narrative marked by hope, fear, and ultimately, a tragic disappearance that lingered like a dark stain upon the cabin's history. Each entry revealed a woman grappling with the isolation of pregnancy, far from the comforts of community, and shadowed by an unknown threat that seemed to close in with every passing day. One passage caught Clara's breath. Lila wrote of nights spent listening to footsteps outside the cabin, the crunch of leaves under heavy boots, and the oppressive silence that followed. She spoke of a presence that watched from the edges of the forest, unseen but palpably close, a threat woven into the very fabric of the woods. The parallels to Clara's own experiences were chilling, the sense of being pursued, of danger lurking just beyond the fragile walls of safety. In the margins, hastily scrawled notes hinted at a desperate hope to escape the cabin's silent prison. Lila mentioned a hidden path, obscured by thick brambles and shadowed by towering pines, leading to a small clearing where she believed she might find help, or at least a moment's reprieve. The map Clara had discovered earlier in the journal now took on new significance. It was a guide to that secret refuge, a lifeline in a world that seemed intent on swallowing Lila whole. Clara's pulse quickened as she traced the lines of the map with trembling fingers. The clearing was marked with a simple symbol, a circle enclosing a single star and a note. Place of refuge and reckoning. The words resonated deeply within her, stirring a mixture of hope and trepidation. This was more than a story. It was a warning, a plea, and a challenge. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the cabin grew colder, Clara sat by the window, gazing out into the forest's tangled depths. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches casting skeletal patterns against the darkening sky. She imagined Lila moving through those woods, her footsteps cautious yet determined, driven by the same desperation that now propelled Clara forward. The wind shifted, carrying a faint rustling sound that set Clara's nerves alight. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and rose, moving toward the door. The cabin's walls felt thinner tonight, the boundary between safety and the unknown growing fragile. Yet beneath the unease was a flicker of resolve, a conviction that she must follow the path Lila had marked, to confront whatever awaited beyond the trees. Clara prepared a small pack with essentials, a worn knife she'd found in a drawer, a coil of sturdy rope, and a bundle of dried herbs from the cabin's sparse supplies. The journal was tucked securely into her bag, its pages a compass guiding her through the shadows. She paused at the threshold of the cabin, the cool night air washing over her face, and listened to the silence that enveloped the forest. The path was hidden, just as the journal had described, obscured by thick undergrowth and fallen branches. Clara's hands brushed aside thorny vines as she stepped cautiously forward, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the stillness. The forest seemed to close around her, a living, breathing entity that watched with quiet intensity. The deeper she ventured, the more the woods transformed. The trees grew taller and straighter, their bark rough against her fingertips as she navigated the narrow trail. Strange symbols etched into the trunks caught her eye. Spirals and crosses carved long ago, their meanings lost, but their presence a reminder that she walked a path tread by others before her. A faint glow filtered through the canopy ahead, and Clara's pace quickened, hope rising like a fragile flame within her chest. Emerging into the clearing, she found a small, open space bathed in moonlight. Wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. At its center stood a weathered stone altar, covered in moss and lichen, as if nature itself sought to reclaim the place. Clara knelt beside the altar, tracing the rough surface with reverence. The air was thick with an ancient energy, a blend of sorrow and sanctity that reached deep into her bones. She closed her eyes, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her, a rhythm that echoed the beating of her own heart. In that moment, the cabin and the forest, the past and present, converged. Lila's story was no longer distant. It was alive within Clara, a warning and a guide. The clearing was a sanctuary and a threshold, a place of refuge and reckoning where the shadows of fear could be faced and perhaps finally laid to rest. As she rose, Clara felt a subtle shift within herself, a strengthening of resolve, a quiet courage that had been forged in the crucible of hardship. The path back to the cabin stretched before her, winding through the trees like a promise. The journey was far from over, but Clara knew that with each step she moved closer to understanding and healing. The night air was cool against her skin as Clara made her way back, the journal's weight a comforting presence at her side. The forest whispered around her, voices carried on the breeze that spoke of endings and beginnings, of stories written in shadows and light. The cabin awaited, its silent walls holding secrets yet to be uncovered, its past entwined with the fragile hope of a future still unfolding. Clara's footsteps were steady now, guided by the knowledge that she was not alone. The echoes of those who had come before her lingered in the trees and stones, their stories a testament to resilience and endurance. In the quiet heart of the forest, amid the tangled roots and whispered memories, Clara found herself part of a larger narrative, one of survival, connection, and the unyielding search for peace. Night had settled over the forest like a thick velvet curtain, swallowing the landscape in shadows deeper than Clara had ever known. The cabin, nestled amidst towering trees and tangled underbrush, stood silent and watchful, its weathered walls holding the secrets of countless nights long past. Tonight, though, the stillness felt charged, not with peace, but with a restless tension that pricked at the edges of Clara's nerves. She sat close to the fireplace, the faint glow of embers casting flickering patterns on the walls, her fingers clutching the worn journal that had become both guide and burden. The weight of the past pressed heavily upon her, the stories of Lila's disappearance and whispered warnings weaving through her mind like a tightening noose. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet. A sharp, deliberate knock at the cabin door. Clara's heart leapt, a cold tremor running down her spine. The knock came again, slow and insistent, echoing through the stillness like a summons from the shadows. Hesitation gripped her, fingers trembling as she rose to face the unknown. She approached the door cautiously, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath her feet. Her hand hovered over the latch, breath shallow and rapid. The knock sounded once more, deliberate and unyielding. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara unlatched the door and pulled it open just enough to peer into the darkness beyond. The night air was thick and heavy, the moonlight barely piercing the dense canopy above. At first, nothing was visible, only the shifting shadows of trees and the faint, distant howl of a lone wolf. Then, from the darkness, emerged a figure. A woman, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. Her clothes were tattered, and her hair hung in damp strands around her face. Clara's breath caught as recognition flickered within her. It was as if the woman had stepped from the pages of the journal itself. "Please," the stranger whispered, voice hoarse and urgent. "I need help." Clara hesitated only a moment before stepping aside, allowing the woman to enter. The cabin's warmth embraced them both, the contrast to the cold night stark and immediate. The stranger collapsed onto the worn floorboards, gasping for breath, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. "Who are you?" Clara asked gently, kneeling beside her. The woman's gaze flickered with pain and relief, and she clutched Clara's hand with surprising strength. "My name is Lila," she whispered, the name resonating like a ghost between them. "I never left this place, not truly." Clara's heart thundered in her chest. The stories she had read, the fears she had felt, they were all real. Lila's presence in the cabin was both a blessing and a curse, a living connection to the past that held its own mysteries and dangers. As the night deepened, Lila spoke in fragmented tales of nights spent hiding from unseen pursuers, of whispers carried on the wind that warned of betrayal, and of a darkness that had seeped into the very soil beneath the cabin. She revealed that the forest was not merely a refuge, but a prison, bound by secrets that refused to remain buried. Clara listened, absorbing the weight of Lila's revelations. The footsteps she had heard, the cold spots and flickering shadows, they were echoes of a past that refused to rest. Lila's story was one of survival against unseen forces, of a desperate fight to protect herself and the child she had carried within this haunted sanctuary. A sudden noise outside shattered the fragile calm. A rustling in the underbrush, a whisper of movement that sent a shiver through the cabin. Lila's eyes darted toward the window, wide with fear. "They're coming back," she whispered. "The ones who never wanted me to leave?" Clara's grip tightened on the journal as she rose, determination hardening her features. The cabin was no longer just a refuge. It was a battleground between past and present, light and shadow. Together, they would have to confront the darkness that lingered in the forest and within the walls. The night stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty and danger. But Clara felt a new strength rising within her. A fierce resolve born of shared history and the unbreakable bond between two women linked by survival. The fight was far from over, but in this moment, they were no longer alone. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the restless whispers of the forest and the promise of reckoning yet to come. The dawn light seeped cautiously through the grimy windows of the cabin, washing over the worn wooden floorboards and casting faint patterns on the peeling wallpaper. Clara sat by the fireplace, its cold hearth a stark reminder of the long night's vigil, while Lila rested on the threadbare quilt, her breathing steady but shallow. The weight of the past still hung heavily in the air, but within Clara, something had shifted. A flicker of strength, fragile yet undeniable. The night's revelations had left Clara raw and unsettled, yet they also ignited a resolve that had been dormant beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. Lila's presence was a living testament to survival, a bridge to the cabin's haunted history and the secrets it guarded so fiercely. Together, they had faced shadows that had once seemed insurmountable, and in doing so, Clara found herself drawing from depths of courage she had not known she possessed. She rose slowly, stretching aching limbs and feeling the subtle movements of the child within her. Each flutter was a reminder of what was at stake, a life that depended on her strength and will. The cabin, with its creaking walls and whispered memories, was no longer merely a shelter, but a crucible in which Clara's resolve was being forged anew. Lila stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet Clara's gaze. There was a softness there, a fragile hope that had survived the darkest nights. "We can't stay here forever," she whispered, voice hoarse but determined. "The past is closing in, and the forest holds more than memories." Clara nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. The cabin, for all its sanctuary, was a nexus of pain and fear, a place where shadows clung stubbornly to the edges of light. To move forward, they would have to confront the unknown beyond these walls, to step into the wilderness not just as fugitives, but as women reclaiming their stories and their futures. The decision was made with the quiet certainty of those who have nothing left to lose, but everything to gain. Clara packed a small bag, gathering the essentials, a few provisions from the cabin, the journal that had guided her through the darkness, and a knife whose blade gleamed with promise. Lila, though fragile, moved with a newfound determination, her steps steady as they prepared to leave the cabin behind. Outside, the forest awaited, dense and inscrutable beneath a sky brushed with pale morning light. The air was crisp and carried the scent of earth and pine, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the cabin. Clara felt the weight of the journey ahead, the unknown path winding through the trees like a ribbon of possibility and peril. As they ventured deeper into the forest, each step was a reclamation, a defiance against the fears that had sought to bind them. The path was uneven, tangled with roots and shadowed by towering trees whose branches whispered secrets in the breeze. Clara's breath came steady, her senses sharpened by the urgency of the moment and the life she carried within. Lila shared fragments of her story along the way, a tale of survival woven through nights of fear and fleeting hope. She spoke of the presence that had haunted the cabin, of whispered threats carried on the wind, and of the desperate need to find a place where the past could finally be laid to rest. Clara listened, absorbing the strength in Lila's voice, drawing courage from the shared experience of pain and resilience. The forest seemed to respond to their passage, the shadows shifting and retreating as if acknowledging their determination. The hidden path Lila had marked in the journal unfurled before them, leading to a clearing bathed in soft light and framed by ancient trees. It was a place of quiet power, where the earth beneath their feet felt solid and sure. Here, Clara paused, the child within stirring with a gentle pulse that mirrored the rhythm of the earth. She knelt, placing a hand on the ground, feeling the steady heartbeat of life beneath her palm. The clearing was more than a physical space. It was a sanctuary for the soul, a place where fear could be faced and transformed. Lila joined her, the two women sharing a moment of silent communion, bound by the trials of the past and the fragile hope of the future. The journey ahead was still uncertain, fraught with the shadows of history and the challenges that lay beyond the forest's edge. But in this clearing, surrounded by the quiet strength of the natural world, Clara found a renewed sense of purpose. As the sun climbed higher, the forest around them seemed to breathe with life and possibility. The path back to the cabin stretched behind them, a reminder of the journey they had undertaken and the stories they carried. Ahead was the unknown, but also the promise of healing and new beginnings. Clara rose, her resolve firm and steady. With Lila by her side and the life within her guiding every step, she faced the wilderness not as a place of fear, but as a realm of transformation. The shadows of the past might linger, but they no longer held dominion over her spirit. Together, they moved forward, women bound by courage, by survival, and by the unyielding hope that even in the darkest places, light could be found. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the dense canopy, casting a soft glow that barely penetrated the thick shadows of the forest. Clara stepped carefully along the narrow path, the earth beneath her boots damp and uneven. Every breath she took filled her lungs with a rich scent of pine and moss, a stark contrast to the stale air she had left behind in the cabin. The journey had been long and fraught with uncertainty. But now, as she moved steadily forward, a cautious hope blossomed within her. Beside her, Lila walked with a quiet determination, her gaze scanning the surroundings as though expecting the forest itself to reveal its secrets. The woman who had once been a ghost in the journal was now flesh and blood, a living testament to survival and resilience. Their footsteps were the only sounds breaking the profound silence, a rhythm that echoed the steady beat of the life growing inside Clara. The hidden path wound deeper into the wilderness, twisting through ancient trees whose gnarled roots reached out like silent sentinels. The forest seemed alive, not just with the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls, but with an intangible pulse, a presence that both unnerved and comforted. Clara felt it keenly, a whisper on the edge of awareness, as if the woods themselves were watching, waiting. Despite the beauty of the surroundings, a tension lingered beneath the surface. Clara's senses were sharpened by the memory of footsteps in the night, of shadows that had moved with intent and menace. The forest was no mere backdrop. It was a living labyrinth of history and pain, where past and present collided in subtle ways. Lila broke the silence, her voice low but steady. "We're close," she said, glancing at a worn map she held loosely in her hand. "The clearing is just beyond that ridge." Clara nodded, her heart quickening. The promise of the clearing, a place of refuge and reckoning, had carried them through the darkest hours. Now, the reality of reaching it felt both a relief and a challenge. What awaited there was unknown, but it held the possibility of answers, of peace. As they crested the ridge, the trees gave way to a small clearing bathed in soft, ethereal light. Wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors muted but vibrant against the backdrop of towering pines. At the center stood a weathered stone altar, its surface worn smooth by time and elements. Moss crept along its edges, and faint carvings hinted at rituals long forgotten. Clara approached the altar cautiously, her fingers brushing over the cold stone. The place radiated a quiet power, a sanctuary carved from the heart of the forest. She closed her eyes, allowing the stillness to wash over her, the rhythm of the earth beneath grounding her in the moment. Beside her, Lila knelt, her expression a mixture of reverence and sorrow. "This was where I sought protection," she murmured, "where I hoped to find a way to break free." Clara's gaze lingered on the altar, sensing the weight of promises made and broken, of fears confronted and endured. The clearing was more than a physical space. It was a crucible for transformation, a place where the past could be faced and perhaps, finally, laid to rest. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy and casting shifting shadows that danced across the forest floor. Clara felt a subtle shift within herself, a deepening resolve tempered by the knowledge that the journey was far from over. The clearing was a waypoint, not a destination. As they prepared to leave, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird were the only sounds. Yet beneath the surface, an unspoken presence lingered. Clara touched her belly gently, feeling the steady pulse within, a reminder of the life she fought to protect. The path back to the cabin stretched before them, winding through the trees like a ribbon of possibility. Each step was a reclaiming, not just of ground, but of agency, of hope. Clara's mind was a swirl of memories and plans, of fears and fierce determination. "We can't go back the way we came," Lila said suddenly, her eyes narrowing. "They know we're here now. The forest isn't safe." Clara nodded, understanding the urgency. The shadows that had haunted the cabin and the woods were no longer distant threats. They were closing in. She felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, not just for herself and Lila, but for the unborn child whose future depended on escape and survival. Together, they veered off the beaten path, plunging into the denser thickets where the forest grew tangled and wild. The underbrush scratched at their skin, and the air grew heavier. But Clara welcomed the challenge. Every obstacle was a barrier against pursuit, a shield woven from the raw power of nature. The hours passed in a blur of movement and quiet vigilance. Clara's body ached, but the life within her thrummed with energy and promise. She drew strength from that connection, from the knowledge that her struggle was not just for survival, but for creation, for new beginnings. As dusk settled once more, they found temporary refuge beneath the protective canopy of ancient trees. The forest around them was alive with whispered voices and shifting shadows, a reminder that the past was never far behind. Yet, in the stillness of the night, Clara felt a fragile peace, a momentary reprieve in the ongoing battle for freedom. She wrapped her arms around herself, drawing warmth from within and from the quiet companionship of Lila. The journey had been harrowing and uncertain, but it had also revealed depths of strength and resilience she had not known she possessed. Tomorrow, and the days beyond, would demand more courage and resolve. But for now, beneath the vast expanse of stars filtered through the leaves, Clara allowed herself to hope, to dream of a future where fear no longer dictated the rhythm of her life. The forest whispered on, carrying with it the echoes of those who had walked these paths before, and the promise that even in the darkest places, light could find its way. The morning sun spilled gently over the horizon, casting warm golden light through the tall pines that encircled the small clearing where Clara and Lila had finally found refuge. The air was crisp and sweet, carrying the fresh scent of earth and new beginnings. Clara sat on a fallen log, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly, feeling the quiet, steady flutter of life within. A tender reminder of hope amidst the shadows that had haunted her journey. The clearing had become more than a physical sanctuary. It was a symbol of survival and transformation, a space where the past's weight could finally begin to lift. Around her, the forest stirred softly, birdsong weaving through the branches, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. Nature's quiet chorus, welcoming the dawn of something new. Clara's thoughts drifted back over the long path that had brought her here. The fear, the isolation, the desperate flight from a life that had once seemed suffocating. All of it now felt both distant and deeply etched within her. She had walked through darkness, carried by a fragile thread of hope, and emerged with a strength she had never known she possessed. Beside her, Lila tended to a small fire, the flickering flames casting warm light on her weathered face. The stories they had shared, the secrets uncovered in the cabin, and the shadows confronted in the forest had forged a bond between them, one rooted in resilience and the unspoken understanding of what it meant to fight for life. Clara smiled softly, the weight of solitude lifted by the presence of another soul who understood the fragility and power of motherhood. Together, they had transformed from fugitives into warriors, reclaiming their stories from the darkness and shaping them into something hopeful. As the day unfolded, Clara began to prepare a simple meal, her movements slow but steady. The act of nurturing herself and the child within became a ritual of healing, an affirmation that life could flourish even in the most unlikely of places. The forest around them seemed to watch with quiet approval, its ancient energy lending strength to their resolve. In the hours that followed, Clara and Lila worked to make the clearing a temporary home. They gathered fallen branches for shelter, collected wild herbs and berries, and fashioned tools from stones and wood. Each task was a step toward rebuilding, a reclaiming of agency and dignity after so much loss. The community of the forest, though silent and unseen, began to feel less like an adversary and more like an ally. Clara found solace in the cyclical rhythms of nature, the steady pulse of life that echoed her own. She realized that motherhood was not just about protection, but about connection to the earth, to others, and to the promise of tomorrow. As twilight approached, painting the sky in hues of rose and lavender, Clara cradled her belly and looked toward the horizon. The journey ahead was still uncertain, fraught with challenges and shadows yet to be faced. But she no longer carried the weight alone. The bond forged with Lila, and the strength drawn from the life within her, had illuminated a path forward. That evening, as stars began to prick the darkening sky, the two women sat together beneath the ancient trees, sharing stories of hope and dreams yet unfulfilled. The forest wrapped them in its quiet embrace, a sanctuary not just of shelter, but of transformation. Clara felt a profound gratitude for the endurance that had carried her through, for the unexpected family she had found, and for the new life that pulsed with promise. In the stillness of the night, surrounded by whispered leaves and the gentle call of night creatures, she whispered a vow to nurture, to protect, and to honor the fragile beauty of beginnings. The clearing, once a mere refuge, had become the heart of a new story, one of survival, connection, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Clara knew that while the past would always be a part of her, it no longer defined her path. With the first light of dawn, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, embracing the promise of a future shaped not by fear, but by courage and hope. The forest listened, and in its ancient silence, a new chapter began.